HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Never a Lovely So Real, The Life and Work of Nelson Algren, by Colin Asher, read by David Colacci. A certain ruthlessness and a sense of alienation from society is as essential to creative writing as it is to armed robbery. The strong armor isn't out merely to turn a fast buck any more than the poet is out solely to see his name on the cover of a book, whatever satisfaction that event may afford him. What both need most deeply is to get even. Nelson Algren, writing in Nonconformity. I have said that nothing factual that I write or say will be as truthful as my fiction. The life, the opinions, are not the work, for it is in the tension between standing apart and being involved that the imagination transforms both. Nadine Gordimer, accepting the Nobel Prize in Literature. The world so big yet so small. It's one block. Nasir Jones on Oludara's Jungle Jay. Introduction. The first thing you should know about Nelson Algren is that he wrote like this. The captain never drank, yet toward nightfall in that smoke-colored season between Indian summer and December's first true snow, he would sometimes feel half-drunken. He would hang his coat neatly over the back of his chair in the leaden station-house twilight, say he was beat from lack of sleep, and lay his head across his arms upon the query-room desk. Yet it wasn't work that wearied him so, and his sleep was harassed by more than a smoke-colored rain. The city had filled him with the guilt of others. He was numbed by his charge sheet's accusations. For 20 years, upon the same scarred desk, he had been recording larceny and arson, sodomy and simony, boosting, hijacking, and shootings in sudden affray, blackmail and terrorism, incest and pauperism, embezzlement and horse theft, tampering and procuring, abduction and quackery, adultery and mackery. Till the finger of guilt, pointed so sternly for so long across the query-room blotter, had grown bored with it all at last, and turned capriciously to touch the fibers of the dark gray muscle behind the captain's light gray eyes. Algren went to lengths to seem tough. He favored dark suits, affected a limp, and acted brashly when he had an audience. But he could write about romantic relationships with uncommon nuance and insight. Those first hours together had been no more than those of any side-street solitary, any bar-wise, woman-wise bookie falling in love with any brash young chick from the suburbs wearing a white batiste. It was autumn, but summer came back a full week just for them. Marriage was a bit he had never regarded seriously, one bit in which he had never seen himself. Marriage, he had always felt, was a standing joke. He had mocked it. She had slipped under her finger a ring that he might have found in a box of Cracker Jacks. Its stones, as it were plastic dice. He had slipped it under her finger intending mockery, a mock marriage. Instead, she had put her lips to it. The mockery failed. The summer air had married them. Algren wrote nonfiction as well, essays, reviews, and articles, and when he turned his attention to social critique, he produced insights so trenchant they remain relevant decades after they were written. He wrote these lines describing the United States, for instance, in 1953. Never has any people possessed such a superfluity of physical luxuries, companioned by such a dearth of emotional necessities. In no other country is such great wealth, acquired so purposefully, put to such small purpose. Never has any people driven itself so resolutely toward such diverse goals, to derive so little satisfaction from attainment of any. Thanks to all that talent, Algren became very famous. He wrote 11 books, and millions of people bought them. His masterpiece, The Man with the Golden Arm, received the first National Book Award, earned him a record sum when its paperback rights were sold, and was adapted for stage and screen. Its protagonist was played by Robert Loggia and Frank Sinatra, respectively. Algren also received the Time magazine award for the novel, 3 Pushcart prizes, an O. Henry Award, and the American Academy of Arts, later the American Academy and National Institute of Arts and Letters, Award of Merit. His 4th novel was adapted into a film starring Jane Fonda and a musical, and inspired the Lou Reed song Walk on the Wild Side. Algren was influential as well, and if you're a fan of American literature, there's a good chance he earned the respect of or inspired your favorite author. In 1940, Richard Wright called Algren the best writer of good prose in the USA. Ernest Hemingway once said Algren was the 2nd greatest living American author after William Faulkner, and later said Algren had topped Faulkner. Ross MacDonald, Martha Gellhorn, Kay Boyle, Jimmy Breslin, Thomas Pynchon, Russell Banks, Betty Friedan, Rachel Kushner, and Don DeLillo have all expressed their admiration for Algren's work, and Cormac McCarthy told Algren, "You were one of the people who influenced me to become a writer." Simone de Beauvoir wrote Algren into 4 of her books, and Hunter S. Thompson once told an interviewer, "I admired Algren and still do. I thought at the time, 1956, that no living American had written any 2 books better than The Man with the Golden Arm and A Walk on the Wild Side." But despite Algren's talent, sales, and influence, his name has been obscure for decades because he forswore writing novels a few years after he became famous. That fact is tragic in its own right, but it's doubly so because the cause of Algren's disillusionment and decline is being revealed in full only now. The Man with the Golden Arm was published in 1949, near the height of the Red Scare, and Algren, a member of the Communist Party in the 1930s, used it to insult a pair of former party members who had begun selling information about their erstwhile comrades to the FBI. Those men were named Louis Boudin's and Howard Rushmore, and Nelson considered them traitors, so he mocked them in his novel. He reimagined each man as a cheap salesman, and on page 219 of Arm he had his protagonist look up at a pair of billboards that read, "Boudin's Coal, 1 price to all. Rushmore Coal, fastest delivery, cheapest in years." No critic mentioned that slight when Arm was released, and no one has in the years since. It's likely few readers ever noticed it, but unfortunately it seems Boudin's and Rushmore did. A few days after Algren received the National Book Award, Boudin's, without being prompted, told an FBI agent that Algren had once been a member of the Communist Party. Rushmore did the same a few months later, and because Algren had so publicly supported the Hollywood 10 and Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, the FBI launched an investigation into his activities that included surveilling his home, opening his correspondence, recruiting his neighbors and landlords as informants, and requesting information on his activities from family members, friends, publishers, agents, the secretary at the YMCA he frequented, business associates, lawyers, the editor of his local newspaper, former political allies, and a psychiatrist who treated him. As a result of the FBI's campaign, Algren was subpoenaed by the House Un-American Activities Committee, barred from obtaining a passport, and investigated, and nearly prosecuted, for perjury and defrauding the government. His publisher suppressed one of his books and then dropped him, and afterward he had a breakdown, attempted suicide, and committed himself to a psychiatric clinic. But though the FBI's scrutiny had profound effects on his life, Algren remained largely ignorant of their activities. They operated in secret, so Algren blamed himself when his life began falling apart. He presumed the paranoia and depression that began to cripple him in the 1950s were the result of personal weakness, and decided his books were not being published because no one wanted to read them. Eventually he recovered and returned to form, but by then too much time had passed, and he was unable to reclaim his former eminence. Though it has long been known that the FBI was interested in Algren, The full extent of their involvement in his life has not previously been revealed, and in the absence of a clear explanation for the foreshortening of Algren's career, people, critics, academics, and fans alike, have relied on speculation to explain it. Some said Algren had writer's block. Others said he drank and gambled his talent away. A few, based on nothing but the fact that he once wrote a book about morphine addicts, claimed he was a drug abuser. And a select group, distrustful of the fact that Algren's characters were often inmates, vagabonds, and petty criminals, attacked the merit of his work and diminished the great intellect that had guided its composition. He's the bard of the stumble-bum, they said, an underworld groupie, a man soaked in puerile sentimentality. But none of that is true, and it is my hope that people will reevaluate his character and work now that a full account of his life is available. It is my desire that readers of this book will come to see Algren as his friend saw him, a man whose death was a tragic loss to the world of laughter, to the spirit and example of generosity and courage, and an irremediable, aching blow to everyone he was close to. And it is my ambition that people will then seek out his best work and read it in the same spirit in which it was read when it was published, a time when critics compared Algren to Dostoevsky, Dickens, and Sandburg, and said his books deserved to be read, remembered, and admired, when he was considered a writer of parables, capable of suggesting the whole contour of a human life in a few terse pages, and when his stories were celebrated for their ability to convey the dramatic sense of right against wrong and ever-kindled hopefulness. Part 1. Becoming someone is a solitary process. From city to city he went now. There was no standing still, and there was no turning back, no place to go and no place to rest, no time to be idling and nothing to do. He moved, everything moved. Men either kept moving or went to jail. Somebody in Boots, 1935. The Story of Isaac, 1820 through 1911. Nelson Algren was 53 years old in the spring of 1962. 5'11", maybe 185 pounds, famous but not wealthy. He lived alone in a third-floor walk-up on Chicago's West Evergreen Avenue, and his lifestyle was idiosyncratic. Nelson's apartment was a canvas, an unmediated expression of his psyche. The air smelled of smoke, and blues records spun on the turntable. There were pictures of Fyodor Dostoevsky, Charles Dickens, and Joan Baez on display in the living room, as well as a German Mauser and a blue helmet that had been recovered from the corpse of a soldier who died during the Ardennes counteroffensive in 1944. Huge collages composed of newspaper and magazine images depicting boxers, racehorses, and baseball players covered the walls, and there were books everywhere, thousands and thousands of them. Their weight made the shelves lining the apartment's walls sag, and piles of them had taken root in the wood floors and started growing toward the ceiling like stalagmites. There was boxing equipment lying around as well, a blue Schwinn, and a metal bread box stuffed with love letters written by Simone de Beauvoir. Time meant little to Nelson, so he enforced no structure on his days. He sat down at his typewriter when he felt the urge to write, and rose when he felt like stopping. Sometimes he worked just long enough to string together a pair of clauses. Other times he wrote in manic bursts that kept him up through the night, typing, smoking, and slashing at his manuscripts with a felt-tipped pen. He visited the Luxor Turkish baths on North Avenue when he wanted to relax, and swam at the YMCA on Division Street when he needed to exercise. He dropped by Jazz Limited and sat near the bandstand when he wanted company, and when his phone rang he lifted the receiver and waited. He didn't speak until he was certain the person on the other end of the line was not an FBI agent. Nelson had once been among the most renowned writers in America, but that time had passed. His last novel was 6 years old, and he swore he would never write another because he had been too badly used. "No novel," he said. "I'd as soon attempt that as I would to open a pizza joint on Chicago's West Side without getting protection first." He wrote whatever he wanted now, or for whoever was paying. Short pieces for the most part, and that was fine. Even if his work never appeared between hard covers again, he would always be the author of Never Came Morning, The Neon Wilderness, The Man with the Golden Arm, Chicago, City on the Make, and A Walk on the Wild Side. Millions of people had read his books. He had done enough. Even though Nelson's fortunes were in decline, interviewers still sought him out. They were young writers mostly, aspirants bearing dog-eared paperbacks and sheepish looks, and when they arrived, Nelson invited them into his front room and offered them bourbon. He signed their books, raked his fingers through his hair, and waited for their questions. "Is it true Hollywood cheated you out of millions?" they asked. "Did Hemingway really say you were the second greatest American writer? When were you in jail? What is Simone de Beauvoir like? And what do you think of Saul Bellow's work?" Interviewing Nelson was tough but rewarding. He chewed on a cigar while he spoke, and he used its stump to punctuate his remarks. His hands danced, his brown eyes twinkled mischievously, and he regularly broke into belly laughs that left him gasping. He frequently responded to direct questions with bawdy jokes or long, loping stories that never concluded, but he always loaded his guests down with the sort of spiky quotes editors love. "Chicago is a great gray sub-civilization," he said. "I'm not second best to anybody. Either I've lapped the field or I'm nowhere. The American way isn't living for the moment," he pronounced. "It is to be insured for 20 years, and then, when you're 40 or 50, to retire. But by that time you can't enjoy anything. I don't know of one writer who has taken a university job who is able to continue to write seriously," he said about Bellow. Nelson would indulge any question asked respectfully, but as he settled into the long twilight of his career, he began taking charge of his interviews. Legacy was on his mind, so he brushed past questions about Beauvoir and Hemingway and dragged his interviewers into the past, through his childhood and his father's and his grandfather's. He had spent his life telling other people's stories, and now it was time to tell his own. "My mother had a candy store," Nelson said. "My father was a machinist. He worked at the screw works, and later he worked for the Packard Motor Car Company. Everyone thinks I'm Polish," Nelson said, "but I'm not. My father's father was a Swede." Nelson's paternal grandfather was named Nils Algren, and he was born in Sweden around 1820. His parents were merchants, and the family lived in Stockholm, then a city of 75,000, built on 14 islands surrounded by the Baltic Sea. A Gothic cathedral dominated the skyline at the time, and stone buildings with peaked roofs faced each other across narrow valleys that sliced through the city like cracks spider-webbing across old porcelain. The air smelled of salt, and ships bobbed in the harbor, three-masted clippers, and dinghies heavy with the weight of lumber, fish, and people. Sweden was in decline when Nils was young, an empire on the dark side of its meridian. There was a recession, and peasants were fleeing the countryside and overwhelming the cities. But despite the country's turmoil, Nils enjoyed a privileged childhood. His eyes were blue as a cloudless sky, and he was healthy and curious. He worked for the family business and had enough leisure time to read, dream, and develop respect for the power of words. The Algrens belonged to the Church of Sweden, a Lutheran denomination, because it was the state religion. Nils became a member at birth and remained one through his teens and into his 20s, but near the end of his third decade he became a skeptic. The Church taught that the Old Testament and the New were both the Word of God, but only the wild apocalyptic majesty of the Hebrew Bible attracted Nils. The vengeful Lord of Genesis spoke to him when he proclaimed, "I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race I have created." And Nils could feel the power of God's wrath when he read that fire rained on Sodom and Gomorrah from the heavens, leaving nothing behind but dense smoke rising from the land. The story of Abraham, a man so devout he was willing to kill his only son when God commanded it, taught Nils about faith and sacrifice. Nils read Deuteronomy as well, and learned that God chose the Israelites out of all the peoples on the face of the earth to be his people, his treasured possession. And afterward he began to question the Church of Sweden's theology. The Old Testament's message seemed clear to Nils. The Jews were God's chosen people, not the Christians. So he relinquished his ties to the Church, announced he had become a Jew, and renamed himself to show the depth of his new faith. At some point near his 30th birthday, Nils Algren became Isaac ben Abraham, or Isaac, son of Abraham. Conversion wasn't uncommon in Sweden at the time, but it always went the other way. What Nils did was a sign either of true piety or pure madness. There were about 3,000 Jews in the country, and they had few rights. A law called the Judereglement prohibited them from marrying Christians, converting Christians, or living outside the country's 3 largest cities. The Swedish Parliament eased those restrictions in 1838, and people rioted in response. The law was soon restored. In that context, it's no surprise that Isaac boarded a ship bound for America. Isaac arrived in New York City alone. He was 33, maybe 34. The manifest of the boat that brought him to America said he was a laborer, but he looked more like a prophet, Moses reborn as a Swede. He moved through the world with the swaggering confidence of a zealot. His eyes shone like turquoise spotlights through a thicket of hair and a full beard, and his speech was inflected with brimstone. Isaac was beyond the reach of his country's bigotry and his family's judgment in America, so he embraced his new identity. He began attending synagogue in New York and introduced himself as a scholar. There were German Jews in the city then, and Poles and Prussians, people who had been born into their faith and suffered for their bloodlines in Europe. And Isaac, a convert, chided them for lapses in their orthodoxy. He tried to debate rabbis and stood on street corners and hollered about the Lord's wrath like a harbinger of the end of days. Soon, though, Isaac realized the city was no place for a true believer, and he went looking for wide-open spaces and greater freedom. He headed west, following a path that had been blazed by an earlier wave of Swedish immigrants. He passed through Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Indiana, then traveled north until he entered the Minnesota Territory, where people lived in log cabins and the government ruled from forts built at the edge of the Dakota Nation. Europeans were free to settle on any plot of land they cared to there, chase vice where it led, and worship any god they chose. So Isaac decided to stay. He became a trader, and for 7 years he earned his living buying and selling pelts. Then the Dakota Sioux started a war. The tribe's territory had been shrinking for years as settlers claimed pieces of it in violation of a treaty, and tribe members were starving because the United States government had failed to pay for land it had agreed to purchase and had taken control of. So the Sioux began attacking settlements and raiding forts. They defeated the territory's militia in the Battle of Redwood Ferry, and afterward civilians fled along wagon trails en masse, their belongings piled on horse-drawn carts, bonnets or wide-brimmed hats on their heads to protect them from the August sun. Isaac was among them. He traveled south after the Dakota Uprising and didn't stop until he reached Chicago, a young city growing up and out along the shore of Lake Michigan. 20 years earlier, there had only been 4,000 settlers in the area, and they had spent their nights hiding inside a fort they built on land they had snatched from the Potawatomi Nation. But when Isaac arrived, there were 25 times that many. New residents were arriving every day, and the city was simultaneously expanding to accommodate them and crumbling beneath their weight. Brick buildings were rising as high as 5 stories, but the Rush Street Bridge collapsed when cowboys drove a herd of cattle across it. Within a year after arriving in Chicago, Isaac met a woman named Jette Scheuer and began to court her. She was a German-born Jew who worked as a servant, and she was only 27 years old. Isaac was 43 by then, but she agreed to marry him anyway. Rabbi Bernhard Felsenthal of the Sinai congregation made them husband and wife on March 29, 1863, and after the ketubah was signed and the Torah reading concluded, the newlyweds abandoned the city. Isaac and Jette moved 30 miles south and east to Indiana and the relative stillness of Lake County, close enough to Chicago to see the city's lights shimmer on the horizon at night, but distant enough to ensure they would have clean air and potable water. They found a bit of unclaimed land near the tip of the Little Calumet River in an area that would later be called Black Oak, and squatted it. Isaac opened a country store, and he and Jette began farming. They decided to start a family, and soon Jette gave birth to a child. She had another the following year, and another the year after that. When Isaac settled into fatherhood and married life, his name began to seem ironic. The fault was all his. He had cursed himself by selecting one that promised much more than he could deliver. The biblical Abraham had been a man willing to sacrifice everything for his faith. His son, the biblical Isaac, had been a settled family man who eschewed concubines and never left Canaan. But Isaac ben Abraham, the man born Nils Algren, had no taste for labor or suffering, and he was no patriarch. Isaac had a convert's desire to seem righteous and act righteously, but he also had the instincts of a grifter. He quoted from the Old Testament fluidly and often, but experimented with perpetual motion when he should have been working, and minted his own coins and used them in place of legal tender. It said he once tried to place his country store on wheels so he could roll it across the county line when tax collectors approached, and he held destiny in higher regard than family. Isaac was a Zionist and a socialist, and he believed he had a religious obligation to move to Jerusalem and build an egalitarian society there. When he pictured the future, he saw himself studying the Torah in the Holy Land, not farming a scrap of dirt in Indiana. In 1866, the power of that vision overwhelmed him, and he abandoned his family and traveled west alone, through the territories and then Nevada, and finally into California. He stopped when he reached San Francisco, where he began preaching on street corners, the way he had when he arrived in America 12 years earlier. Then Jette caught up to him. She had placed her 2 eldest children in someone's care and chased Isaac across the country carrying her youngest son, Moses. She reconciled with Isaac when she found him, and they made a new home by the San Francisco Bay and began saving money so they could sail for the Holy Land. They had a son the following year and named him Gershom, after the son of the biblical Moses. Next they had a daughter and named her Hannah, after the mother of Samuel, last of the Hebrew judges. The Abraham family crossed the Pacific and the Red Sea in 1868 and then proceeded toward Jerusalem by land. They must have seen the city for the first time when they crested the Mount of Olives. The glittering Al-Aqsa Mosque would have been visible, as would the Temple Mount and the white crenulated.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?